It is just past 7 in the morning on March the 23rd, 2021. In the southern stretch of the Suez Canal, a massive container ship moves slowly through the narrow channel. On board are 25 crew members, mostly from India. Above them, stacked 12 high, are more than 18,000 containers. Inside those containers is almost everything imaginable: furniture, medical equipment, auto parts, coffee beans destined for European supermarkets. Behind the Ever Given, a long queue of vessels follows in formation, all moving northward through the canal in a single coordinated convoy. The wind picks up. A sandstorm has been building for hours, and gusts of nearly 50 miles per hour begin to push against the side of the ship. The vessel is more than 400 meters long, longer than the Empire State Building is tall, and like a sail catching the wind, it begins to drift. The pilot in the bridge issues corrections, the rudder swings, but the ship is no longer responding the way it should, and within minutes the bow buries itself into the eastern bank of the canal, the stern swings into the western bank, and one of the busiest waterways in the world is now sealed shut. This is the story of the Ever Given. The Suez Canal is a thin slit of water carved through the Egyptian desert. It is just under 200 kilometers long and at its narrowest, less than 300 meters wide. But this small artificial waterway is one of the most important pieces of infrastructure on the planet. It connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, and in doing so, it lets ships travel between Europe and Asia without having to sail all the way around the southern tip of Africa. Roughly 12% of global trade passes through this canal, around 30% of the world's container traffic, about 1 million barrels of oil, and 8% of the world's liquefied natural gas every single day. For Egypt, the canal is also one of the country's most important sources of foreign revenue. It generates roughly $5 to $6 billion in transit fees every year, money that flows directly into the state. When the canal stops working, Egypt loses millions in fees per day on top of everything else. When the canal first opened in 1869, the largest ships in the world could carry about 4,000 tons of cargo. The Ever Given, more than 150 years later, carries over 200,000. Built in 2018 by a shipyard in Japan, the Ever Given belongs to a class of vessels called ultra-large container ships. These are not just big. They are at the absolute upper limit of what the canal can physically hold. The locks of the Suez were widened in 2015 specifically so that ships of this scale could pass through. And on this particular morning, the Ever Given is loaded to nearly its full capacity. At 7:42 a.m. local time, the ship loses control. Within minutes, satellite tracking shows what is happening. The vessel has rotated diagonally across the canal. The bow is wedged into one bank, the stern into the other, and traffic in both directions comes to a complete stop. For the first few hours, the situation does not seem catastrophic. Groundings in the Suez Canal happen occasionally. They usually get resolved within a few hours. The Canal Authority dispatches a small fleet of tugboats which begin pushing against the hull. From the photos that start to circulate online, the scale is hard to grasp. The tugs look like toys next to the wall of the hull. By the end of the first day, the ship has not moved an inch. A 400-meter container vessel has run aground in the Suez Canal. Traffic in both directions is now blocked. Officials say the cause may have been high winds during a sandstorm earlier this morning. By the second day, more than 100 ships are waiting to cross. By the third, that number passes 200, and the world begins to realize that this is not going to be fixed quickly. The cargo on these waiting ships includes nearly everything that moves between Asia and Europe: crude oil headed for refineries, live animals in transport, tea from Sri Lanka, auto parts that car factories in Germany were counting on to keep their production lines running, toilet paper, coffee, children's toys. Some ship operators begin to consider a different route. The alternative is to sail around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. This adds about 9,000 kilometers and roughly 10 to 14 days to the journey. It also costs hundreds of thousands of dollars in extra fuel per ship. A handful of vessels begin to turn around. Most decide to wait it out. Meanwhile, the salvage operation grows. A specialist Dutch firm called Smith Salvage is brought in. They are among the most experienced marine salvage companies in the world, and their plan has several layers. First, dredgers begin removing sand from around the bow. The Ever Given is wedged into a hard layer of rock and clay at the eastern bank, and it has to be cut free. By the third day, dredgers have removed tens of thousands of cubic meters of material from the bottom. Second, additional tugboats arrive. Eventually, more than a dozen are working on the ship at once, including some of the largest and most powerful tugs operating in the region. Third, the team begins to consider unloading containers from the top of the vessel. This would lighten the ship and reduce its draft. But removing thousands of containers from a 400-meter ship in the middle of a canal, using cranes that do not yet exist on site, is described by engineers as a last resort. It would take weeks, and every day the canal remains closed, an estimated $9 billion in trade is delayed. At the peak of the operation, the bow has been buried about 5 meters into the bank. The sand around it is so compacted that even high-powered dredgers struggle to make progress. By the end of the operation, around 30,000 cubic meters of material have been removed from the canal floor, enough to fill 12 Olympic-sized swimming pools, a global audience. While the work continues, something else happens. The image of the ship, diagonal, stuck, dwarfing the tiny excavator working at its bow, begins to spread across the internet. Within 48 hours, the Ever Given is everywhere. A small yellow digger photographed from a low angle next to the enormous hull becomes one of the most shared images of the year. People begin to project meaning onto it. The little excavator becomes a metaphor for whatever feels overwhelming in their own lives. The ship becomes a metaphor for global capitalism or supply chain fragility or the early 2020s themselves. It is a strange kind of internet moment. A global trade crisis becomes a meme before it is even resolved. But behind the humor, the actual stakes keep climbing. On the fifth day, the waiting line of ships passes 300 vessels. Some of them carry livestock that is beginning to run out of food and water. Insurance claims start to pile up, and companies that rely on just-in-time delivery, the idea that parts arrive exactly when they are needed and inventory is kept low, begin to feel real pressure. Other countries begin to feel the pressure too. Syria starts rationing fuel as oil shipments stall. Romania reports that 130,000 live sheep on board waiting ships may be at risk, and shipping rates on alternative routes begin to climb sharply as carriers compete for limited space. The breakthrough finally comes on the sixth day. The salvage team has been working with the tides. The Suez Canal is not a tidal river, but in the southern section where the Ever Given is stuck, the connection to the Red Sea creates a small daily rise and fall in water level. The team has been timing their efforts to coincide with high tide when the ship sits a little higher in the water. In the early morning hours of March 29th, a particularly high tide is expected. It is being boosted by the alignment of the sun and the moon during the full moon phase. With the bow dredged free and the tugs at full power, the team waits. At around 4:30 a.m., the stern begins to swing. The tugboats heave, and after nearly 6.5 days of being wedged into the bank, the Ever Given is afloat again. The canal reopens the same day. The backlog of ships, which has now grown to more than 400 vessels, takes another 6 days to fully clear. Shipping routes around the world continue to feel the effects for weeks. Some products arrive late, some never make it at all, and for an industry that operates on margins where days matter, the disruption is enormous. But the legal aftermath is just beginning. The Suez Canal Authority impounds the ship and demands close to $1 billion in compensation, citing damages, lost canal fees, and the cost of the salvage operation. The ship's owners and insurers push back. The Ever Given and its crew, including the 25 sailors who had nothing to do with any of this, remain anchored in a lake in the middle of the canal for more than 3 months while the dispute is negotiated. The crew themselves become a footnote in most of the coverage, but for them the experience is anything but. Most have not seen their families in months. They are not allowed to leave the ship while the dispute is ongoing. And under maritime tradition, the captain bears formal responsibility for what happened, even though the actual grounding was the result of conditions no single person could fully control. Some are eventually replaced, others stay on board until the legal dispute is resolved. Eventually, a settlement is reached. The exact amount is never made public. The ship is finally released in July, and after a long journey, it continues on to its original destination in Rotterdam, more than 100 days late. What the Ever Given exposed, more than anything else, is how thin the margins of global trade really are. The system that brings groceries to supermarkets, parts to factories, and goods to online retailers depends on an enormous and largely invisible network of ships, ports, and waterways. And much of that network passes through a small number of choke points: the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, the Strait of Malacca, the Strait of Hormuz. Each of these connects continents. Each one moves a disproportionate share of what the world buys and sells. And each one is a single point of failure in a system that does not really have a plan B. When one of those choke points fails, even for a few days, the cost is measured in the billions, and the world only really sees the system at all when it stops working. It is tempting to look at a single grounded ship as a freak event: high winds, a difficult turn, an unlucky pilot. But the deeper story is that this kind of failure was always possible. The ships have gotten larger, the canal has gotten busier, the margin for error has gotten smaller, and the just-in-time logic that runs modern supply chains assumes nothing will go wrong long enough to matter. For 6 days, the Ever Given showed what happens when that assumption breaks. Years later, the image of the stuck ship still circulates online. It has become a kind of shorthand for overreach, for fragility, for the strange feeling of watching a global system pause because of a single object lodged in a single narrow place. And in a way, that is what makes the story stick. Not the engineering, not the lawsuit, but the realization that something most of us never thought about: a stretch of water through the Egyptian desert, less than 300 meters wide, turned out to be holding so much of the modern world together. Thank you so much for watching.